I'd like to welcome everybody to the third in a series of videos that are being created by the Maryland Group Against Smokers Pollution under the overall rubric of Merchants of Death. The first two videos were somewhat technical. The first dealt with smoking in multi-unit housing. The second dealt with smoking in casinos. Today is going to be somewhat different. It's not going to be quite as technical. We're going to be talking about a lawsuit that was filed by the U.S. government against the tobacco industry. And we're going to talk about how we were on the verge of an incredible super victory, and then somehow we lost most of it. In other words, had it snatched away by a change in the administration. I'd like to introduce the cast members here initially before we get on with the program. To my right over here is Bill Ali. Now Bill is a long-time fighter for tobacco control. I think his chief claim of distinction is that he founded an organization called the Federal Employees for Non-Smokers' Rights, and they actually ended up suing the U.S. government for a smoke-free workplace. And this was way back in the late 1970s when you could smoke anything, anywhere, anytime. They didn't win the case, but they sure caused a lot of interest throughout the country. The next person is Jim Rapace, and Jim has a history with the Environmental Protection Agency. He was a thorn, and I might say a major thorn, in the side of the tobacco industry when he was working for the EPA. And he was so successful that he was awarded the Surgeon General's Medallion by Surgeon General Koop. The final person here is Sharon Eubanks. And Sharon is the star of our show today. She was the lead attorney in a lawsuit against the tobacco industry on behalf of the United States government. And she's here to talk about that show. And of course, I forgot about myself. I'm the president of the Maryland Group Against Smokers Pollution. And I've been opposing the tobacco industry ever since my mom died of cancer in 1973. So that's been a long time. But let's get to the important part of our show here today. And that's with Ms. Sharon Eubanks here. Sharon, you were the lead counsel on the racketeering case brought by the Department of Justice against the tobacco industry. Could you tell us a little bit about how that came to pass?
Well, yeah, I had worked in the civil division for quite some time, and it just looked like an interesting project to work on. And someone mentioned to me, would you be interested in doing this? And at the time, they already had selected a head for the program, and I was a deputy in another office, and I said, well, let me check into it. So I did. And I thought, well, this looks like an adventure, so I thought I would go on it. I had no idea what I was in for at the time, none at all.
Well, okay, you ended up representing the USA, and this was the largest civil case ever filed against an industry that was known for its dirty tricks and financial resources. What was that like? Well,
it was like hell. It really was. I mean, there's no better way to describe it. The resources that they had versus, you often think of your government as having unlimited resources, but that's not the case. Here we had Philip Morris, Lorillard, R.J. Reynolds Tobacco, all of the major tobacco companies in America, along with BAT, British American Tobacco, and all of their feral lawyers. There were over 400 lawyers on the other side. And by the time we went to trial, we had only like 45 people on staff, and not all of those were lawyers. We never had any more than 34, 35 lawyers on the case. So it was difficult because there were numbers of issues coming from each of the defendants that would try to occupy our time to take us away from what the focus of the case was, which was it was a fraud case. The fraud that had been perpetrated on the American people by these members of the industry who had lied about the health consequences of smoking, who had lied about secondhand smoke and its effect, knowing that they were telling lies at the time, who had lied about manipulating nicotine to make cigarettes more addictive, who lied about marketing to children in order to get them hooked, who lied about everything that really mattered. That's what made it a racketeering case. And to take our focus away, there were satellite issues galore. And it was a challenge.
Yeah, well, you know, it's kind of interesting because Sharon has written a book. Incidentally, she got so disgusted at the end of this trial that she resigned from the U.S. government. And she ended up writing this book called Bad Acts. And that's the title of our show today, Bad Acts. And I've read every word in that book, and having some experience with the tobacco industry, I know some of the things, and I felt your pain as you went through there with all the diversions and so on and so forth. Now, I know that Jim Rapace there encountered the tobacco industry during his EPA days, and I was wondering, what is the difference between what you did and what the EPA was
Well, the
trying to do?
EPA was part of our case. In fact, Jim was mentioned in some of the documents as well as some of the testimony that came in, because the industry went after Jim to try to get him fired. The EPA had done what was called, the industry calls secondhand smoke ETS, which is, you know, environmental tobacco smoke, which makes it sound like it's just something in the air, it'll be okay. You know, it's a euphemism. I mean, it's killer like everything else about cigarettes. Well, anyway, the EPA was a defendant in the case, and we had to produce all of their documents. And the EPA ETS risk assessment that EPA had done, there had been litigation by the industry on that. And Jim Rapace was a large part of what had happened over at the EPA, even though at the beginning we didn't know that. They never asked for Jim's deposition while I was on the case anyway, which was the whole time, so they never asked for your deposition, which is a surprise.
I am not surprised. They wouldn't have appreciated what I had to say. And so since they had tried to get me fired and subpoenaed me to come over and testify before Congressman Bliley's committee, and then they backed out when I refused.
Well, Congressman Bliley was an interesting person. I mean, we had talked about him before. I believe you gave him a nickname?
The congressman from Philip Morris.
Well, I didn't know until today that that was your handle that had been bestowed on him. And he got a bunch of documents from the industry. A lot of the documents that we see today, some of the ones that strike you as this is the most disgusting industry. It shows the fraud on, you know, in black and white on paper, what they knew when they knew it, and how they concealed that information from dissemination to the public. Anyway, Congressman Bliley is the one who took the documents in from the industry when he subpoenaed them from them or asked for them. They said, we're not giving these to you pursuant to subpoena, but keep them secret and, you know, make sure that you don't disseminate it. Well, Congressman Bliley got the documents and put them up on the internet. Shocking. Shocking. So my thought, I never asked the man, I mean, why did he do that? I think because he read the documents and he saw what was happening.
Just to give you some idea of Congressman Bliley, he actually came after Jim Rapace. I have seen the letters that he wrote to the head of the Environmental Protection Agency, just beating the tar out of Jim Rapace and suggesting that he be taken off of all these functions and so on, and essentially put in a cellar somewhere.
I've read a lot of those. In fact, I read all of those letters because they came in while I was there. But it didn't occur to me until I started writing my memoir that Bliley probably knew very little of what the content of those letters were. They were authored by a team put together by the tobacco companies, and with the aid of their lawyer at Covington, John Rupp, who was the external counsel for the Tobacco Institute. Those letters came in to Bliley's tobacco aide, Jeff Schlagenhauf. And Schlagenhauf was the one who orchestrated all of these letters, and I think basically he just got Bliley to sign off on it. Bliley had been a mortician in Virginia. He ran, so there was a symbiotic relationship between Bliley and the tobacco companies. They drummed up a lot of business for his funeral parlors. And so when I walked into Bliley's office to be ostensibly interviewed by Schlagenhauf while I was at the EPA, I was absolutely stunned because there was a giant collage of Philip Morris cigarettes right above his reception desk. And that's when I thought, my God, this is the congressman from Philip Morris.
Well, you know what was so interesting to me about in the beginning of the case? I did not realize in the very beginning, it was touch and go on whether we would have secondhand smoke be a part of the case and the complaint in the first place. And 3 o'clock in the morning, when we were putting the whole thing together, one of my bosses over from the main building was like, the science, you know, is the science there? I'm thinking the 1986 Surgeon General's report said that there is a connection between secondhand smoke and disease. And we filed a lawsuit in 1999. So yeah, there was a correlation, definitely a direct relationship. But the industry had not really been found, and that's why what Jim had done at the EPA was so important, because the EPA had looked at indoor air quality, you know, and they had said that, you know, can you get rid of this with, you know, filters and this kind of thing? Not so much. And it was a Class A carcinogen. So that was the finding of this EPA ETS risk assessment, which was so harmful to the industry that they stacked lawyer against just lawyers on that whole issue as it went through the appeals court to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals in down in Richmond to finally getting a decision. But they brought all of those issues into our case to defend against our position, saying that you have no right to do this. In fact, it's being litigated elsewhere, and you shouldn't even be talking about it here. But I appreciate what you did.
Thank you.
You know, it's interesting because I actually got indirectly involved in this lawsuit. And I was actually retiring from NSA after being there for over 30 years. And the last 20, I was a senior executive, and I had a huge office with all kinds of documents, just hundreds and hundreds of piles of documents and so on. And I had 2 days to get rid of all this stuff. And so I'm in there with my secretary trying to decide what to, you know, get rid of and what to keep and where to send stuff and so on and so forth. And I got a call from the general counsel's office. And they said, hey, John, I knew the general counsel, and he said to me, he said, hey, John, he said, we need to get every document that you have related to tobacco control here at the agency. Now, since I was a key person in NSA that got our agency to go totally smoke-free, and since I had written a lot of articles for our NSA newsletter and all that sort of stuff, I had boxes of stuff on this. And since I gave briefings to the director on this, trying to get our agency to go smoke-free, I had several boxes of this stuff. And they said they wanted them. So I said, well, you can't have them. And they said, well, we want them. And I said, well, you can come in and make copies of them, but you can't have them because when I leave this agency, if the tobacco industry comes after me, I said, I need to have all this stuff, you know, as potentially to defend myself. So what they did is they sent 2 lawyers down to my office, and they started going through this stuff. And they kept bugging me about, should this be classified, should that be clean? Remember, I worked in a very classified agency. And it was just a real pain in the neck. And finally, I told them, I said, look, why don't you just reproduce everything, give me the originals back, and so on. And so they went to a repro machine right outside my office there and did that, but they kept coming back in.
Well, I should thank you because, you know, a lot of the agencies, and there were over 20 agencies that had documents. That was the first order that was entered in the case, oddly enough, called Order Number 1. And there were hundreds of orders in the case, which required a preservation of all tobacco-related documents. And so a lot of the agencies complained about the effort and what they had to do, but I never heard any complaints from your former agency about what needed to be done, and we gathered the documents. There were 71 billion, with a B, pages of records that the federal government had in its possession, custody, or control, which were required to be preserved. If, in order to get out of that preservation order, if it had anything to do with tobacco at all, we had to go through an extensive process with the industry where we sat down with them and said, this is what these documents are. Is it okay if we destroy them? And then they would say, well, give us a sampling. And we'd give them a sampling, and they'd say that's not enough. Meanwhile, the agencies are telling us this is costing the American taxpayers a lot of money to preserve, but we had a court order to do it. Yet one of the many dirty tricks.
It's interesting because we've already talked about how the tobacco industry came after Jim. Did they come after you during the course of this trial, or was it afterwards, Sharon, or
I think it was more afterwards. I was too, embedded in the whole issue of what we were doing at the time to know if they were coming after me during the trial. At one point, when the administration changed, I looked at, from the administration that filed the case was the Clinton administration, and the Bush administration people came in after that, and we're used to changes of administration at the agencies, and they're seamless. There may be some small changes in what you're doing or whatnot. And so we got actually more money for the case during the Bush administration to pursue the case, and we were basically left alone until it was at the end of the case, where they stepped in and made us reduce the remedy that we were seeking from $130 billion for a smoking cessation program to help Americans stop smoking to something like $12 billion, and without any good reason for doing so. After I left, retired from the Department of Justice, the industry intervened on a number of occasions to ensure that I didn't have work. How do I know that? I have written proof of it. I have a letter, and but we move on. They can't. I would do it all again if I had to. I loved the work. It was important work, and the findings of fact that came out of the judge's decision have been very useful in efforts that all of you have engaged in smoke-free and trying to keep and make areas smoke-free in this country.
Yeah, it shows how vindictive they actually are, that they would come after her after she had gone from the government. And in fact, although they came after me, and that's been pretty well known for decades, they came after a lot of other scientists as well. And I remember Bill Blott at the National Cancer Institute, for one. There were several other scientists who, such as Dr. Hirayama in Japan, who they tried to discredit, and Dimitris Trikopoulos in Greece, whose work on secondhand smoke they also tried to discredit. And they had a whole huge machine of moles, industry moles, who were scientists or professors at universities on their payroll, who would be paid to try to discredit these. And that was par for the course. But even if you get out of the scientific area and you get into the fields of journalism or television, I've talked to people who were on the Associated Press, on CBS News, ABC News, you name it. If they did stories that were unfavorable to the industry, even the Reader's Digest, which has been anti-smoking forever, they came after them too. What they would do is they would complain to your boss, to your management, that you got the facts wrong or you were a zealot, and they would try to turn you into a green monkey.
Right.
And so this was their standard operating procedure.
It's kind of interesting, although this is a little bit off the subject. Bill kind of ran into some of that sort of effort when you were with the Agency for International Development and you were trying to pursue your smoke-free areas. Could you give us a few words on that, what they did with you there, Bill?
Well, I was a union member. I was a union steward. And I was the representative of the American Federation of Government Employees on the Occupational Safety and Health Advisory Committee. And so what we did when we first formed was to take a survey. And we asked employees what the different problems were. And of all the problems that the employees reported on, problems with smoking was number one. So I decided that we had to set up our work plan that started with the biggest problem first and the smallest problem last. And I ran afoul of smoking officials at higher levels than I was. Fortunately, I was in league with the State Department's medical service. They knew the problems and they supported us. But when I went around showing people what the results were and saying we obviously have to work on that, I got pushed back from the government. And eventually I found them trying to build a case against me for using government time. Bear in mind, I'm the health and safety representative. I'm supposed to have time to investigate these things. I showed up with a special machine I obtained from Mr. Rapace, and I measured what the indoor pollution was at the State Department. Oh, they were aghast. Well, it's like meat inspections. You don't announce to the restaurant, we're going to come in and make a surprise inspection at this time in this place to see how clean you are and whether you can keep your license. You don't announce it in advance. And I showed up and did it. So I almost lost my job several times. The State Department people came after me.
This was in the late 1970s.
This was later than that. This was
early
later.
80s?
It was in the 1980s, the late 1980s. They came after me. Fortunately, I use my own time for much of this stuff, and I wasn't required to. And since I got people to defend me, such as an office chief who was a smoker and didn't like what was happening, plus the doctors at State Department, and I won a prize from the Government Employees Insurance Company, a Health and Safety Award for working against substance abuse, a banquet on Capitol Hill,
Yeah, I remember attending that.
$2,500, and a free tour of a capital of an important country, Washington, D.C. But we won. And about
Congratulations.
3.5 years after you went smoke-free, we went smoke-free.
Great. Before we get off the subject, and we're getting close to the end of the program here, Sharon, you were successful in certain aspects of the case, even though the monetary damage was reduced. Could you tell us what we did get out of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing that we got out of it was the main thing that we needed to get out of it. And that is, we have a lengthy opinion, several hundred pages long, by a neutral fact finder, that is Judge Gladys Kessler, in the DC District Court, Federal District Court, making specific findings about the wrongdoing of these defendants, with a great deal of specificity, including Mr. Rupp and his wrongdoings. I mean, if there's any, the comfort there, he was called out by the judge in terms of bad acts and the wrong things that I shouldn't say wrong things, the illegal things that the industry had done. And I think advocates, both anti-smoking advocates, smoke-free advocates are free to use this information to point out that this is a fact. It is a found fact. The case has been up through the appellate process and back down again. These are final and irreversible, and these conclusions in their numbered paragraphs happened. So to me, the use of that to all of us who advocate for smoke-free air, for not just smoke-free air, but to try to get people to understand what's happening to them, how they got hooked, or to even stop the marketing to children, that those findings of fact are invaluable tools for advocates.
Yeah, and I think one of the important aspects of this is that the tobacco companies have been convicted of fraud. They are basically racketeers by the true definition of the word racketeers.
Yeah,
because
just like
they were
mafia.
convicted under the RICO racketeer laws.
Yeah, they're just like the mafia, which in 1971 Congress passed the RICO statute to deal with organized crime. This is a civil suit, and no one went to prison over it. But the elements of the organized illegal activities that they undertook led to a finding that they were racketeers.
So Sharon, how many years of your life did this take?
Well, it depends on whether you count in dog years or human years. But I started working on it in 1999, April 15th, tax day, 1999. And I walked away from it all on December 1st, 2005. The trial was 9 months, like giving birth, all right? And the discovery was everything from starting around 2000 up until actually 2005, because there was discovery that occurred during the case. It took a lot to do it. I had 3 small children at home at the time. But luckily the trial was in Washington, D.C., and I live in the Virginia suburbs, so luckily I could go home for a few minutes every day. And I would definitely do it again. It was an important, it is an important case. It is important work that all of you are continuing to do. And, you know, I'm not sorry. A more sane person may have walked away from it sooner.
Well, I'd just like to point out again that I think Sharon isn't quite as strong on this program as she is in this book, because she tells in this book about all of the dirty tricks the administration pulled on her, and her, I guess, the new guy that came in there, and how he, I don't know whether you want to discuss any of that or not.
Robert McCallum is his name. He came in, he took over, he was good friends with President Bush. He was in Skull and Bones with him at Yale University. And so they were quite close, and a lot of the information or activities were coming from the White House, telling us this is what you need to do. So yeah, it's in the book, it's in Bad Acts, and there are lots of bad acts to go around.
Yeah, well, when you're dealing with the tobacco industry, there are too many bad acts. There are more than enough to go around. The tobacco industry overflows with them. Well, I think that that's the end of the program is drawing very, very near here. So would you care to make any wrap-up statement?
You want me to do a
here?
closing statement? Yes.
I know you're a lawyer now,
I'm
so
looking
you
into
better
the
keep it
camera and I'm telling everybody that I'm a member of Americans for Non-Smokers' Rights. I'm on their board. I'm an officer there. And the next smoke-free issue, I think, for all of us to face is going to be electronic cigarettes. So learn all that you can, but I just ask you this question, and it's a rhetorical one. Do you really want that vapor or whatever it is to be on you as a person who's not smoking it? You know, there are going to be fights to extend existing non-smoking laws to envelop the same thing with respect to electronic cigarettes. We know enough now to know that we don't need to have that as a secondhand smoke issue. So I would urge everybody to become educated about it and to help keeping America and all of our communities and our children smoke-free.
As a scientist, I completely agree with what she just said about electronic cigarettes.
And I would like to point out that if anybody out there has any questions on normal tobacco or the e-cigarette issue, please feel free to contact us at mdgasp@aol.com. That's marylandgasp@aol.com. We have experts. I would like to point out that Sharon is absolutely correct. Today, e-cigarettes are totally unregulated. I mean totally unregulated. Nobody really knows what's in those things because no government or any other organization has ever measured what's in those things. And so that is a major issue that's coming up. And I guess that, does anybody else, we're on our final wrap here real quick.
I think nobody really knows what's in those things. Even the manufacturers don't, because they keep changing the liquids that go into them. There are several hundred different brands, and they're all quite different.
Right.
And some of them have really toxic chemicals in them.
Okay.
So it is a big problem.
Okay, well, I guess that's about it. And be sure to look forward to some future events that we're going to be having like this. We're going to be talking about how Maryland became smoke-free, and that's probably going to take several shows like this because it took us about 35 years to achieve that goal.
Well, congratulations.
And we've got tons and tons of material, and we will be bringing out some names of people and the good guys and the bad guys with regard to that as well. So thank you very much for watching.